I watched Marcus flip through the prenup pages with the same arrogance he'd worn to every family dinner for the past 2 years. His manicured fingers, paid for with my family's money, though he didn't know I knew that yet, skimmed over the legal text like he was reading a grocery list. "This seems pretty standard, babe," he said, not bothering to look up at me. "Property division, spousal support, yada yada. Your dad's lawyers really went overboard with the length, though." I kept my face perfectly neutral, the same mask of naive love I'd perfected in this second life. "Daddy just wants to protect both of us. You know how thorough he can be?" Marcus laughed, that same condescending chuckle that had echoed in my nightmares for months after my death. "Right. Well, good thing I'm marrying you for love, not money." He signed his name with a flourish, that expensive Mont Blanc pen, another gift from my father, scratching across the signature line. There, happy? If only he knew how happy. If only he knew that buried in Section 47, subsection 12, paragraph C, was a little clause about debt assumption. If only he knew about the $23 million in gambling debts, business loans, and credit obligations I'd been carefully accumulating under shell companies for the past 18 months. But Marcus Chen had never been one for reading fine print. In my previous life, that carelessness had cost me everything. In this one, it would cost him. "Ecstatic," I whispered, watching him slide the papers back across the mahogany table in my father's study. The same study where, in another timeline, I'd found the evidence of their conspiracy. The same desk where I'd discovered the forged documents that had stolen my inheritance. The same room where my sister Victoria had laughed as she explained how easy it had been to convince everyone I was mentally unstable. Marcus stood up, straightening his Italian suit, Armani purchased with money that should have been mine. "Now, can we please go tell your family the good news? Victoria's been texting me all morning about the engagement party preparations." Of course she had. My dear sister, who in my first life had seduced my fiancé 6 months before our wedding, convinced him to help her forge documents transferring my trust fund, then had me committed to a psychiatric facility when I tried to expose them. Who had stood over my hospital bed and whispered, "You were always too trusting, Elena. Did you really think someone like Marcus would choose you over me?" I died in that facility. Accidental overdose, the death certificate had read. Victoria had cried such pretty tears at my funeral, standing next to Marcus as the grieving sister and heartbroken almost widower. They'd married 6 months later in the same church where my wedding was supposed to take place. But here I was, 25 again, with 26 years of memories crowded into my reborn mind. Here I was, with a second chance and a very detailed plan for revenge. "Of course," I said, standing up and smoothing my dress, a modest pink Chanel that made me look innocent and harmless. "Let's go share our happiness." The word tasted like poison in my mouth, but I'd gotten very good at swallowing poison in this life. The difference was, this time, everyone else would be choking on it too. We walked down the marble hallway toward the dining room, Marcus's hand possessive on my lower back. The same touch that had once made me feel cherished now made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to lean into it, just a few more months. Just until the wedding. "Elena, darling," my stepmother Diane's voice echoed from the dining room, sugar sweet and venomous as always. "Come tell us everything." As we entered the room, I saw them all arranged like players in a familiar play. Diane, perfectly coiffed in her trademark pearls, sitting at the head of the table that had once been my mother's. Victoria, stunning in emerald silk that complemented her dark hair, eyes already calculating how to steal this moment like she stole everything else. My father, Richard Hawthorne, looking older than his 60 years, already 3 whiskeys deep though it wasn't yet noon. And scattered around the table, the supporting cast of enablers, trust fund friends, and social climbers who had watched my destruction in my first life without lifting a finger. They'd all be here for the wedding. They'd all witness the show. "We're engaged," I announced, holding up my left hand to display the massive diamond Marcus had presented 2 weeks ago. The same ring he'd given Victoria in my previous life, bought with money embezzled from my trust fund. The room erupted in congratulations, champagne appearing as if by magic, toasts being raised to our happiness. I smiled and laughed and played the part of the blushing bride-to-be, but inside I was counting. Counting days until the wedding. Counting the zeros in my carefully accumulated debt. counting the ways this would all come crashing down around them. "And when's the happy day?" Diane asked, though I knew she already knew. She'd been planning this wedding since the day she'd married my father, seeing it as the perfect way to cement Victoria's position as the heir to the Hawthorne fortune. 6 months, Marcus answered, his arm sliding around my waist. Elena wanted a spring wedding. How romantic, Victoria purred, and I caught the look that passed between her and Marcus. The same look they'd shared in my previous life, thinking I was too stupid to notice. I've already started making some calls about venues. As your maid of honor, it's my duty to make sure everything is perfect. Maid of honor. In my first life, she'd used that position to sabotage everything, switching my wedding dress for one 3 sizes too small, replacing my chosen flowers with ones I was allergic to, even bribing the photographer to delete half the photos. All while playing the devoted sister, the one making sure her unstable sibling didn't ruin her own wedding. That's so thoughtful of you, I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Her skin felt like ice, but her smile was warm as summer. I don't know what I'd do without you. Sisters have to stick together, she replied, and the irony was so thick I almost choked on it. The conversation flowed around me, venue options, guest lists, flower arrangements, but my mind was elsewhere, calculating. In my first life, I'd been so focused on the wedding preparations that I'd missed all the signs. The private meetings between Victoria and Marcus, the forged signatures on legal documents, the gradual isolation from anyone who might have warned me what was happening. This time, I'd been watching from the very beginning. This time, I knew exactly what they were planning because I'd lived through it before. They thought they were so clever, but I was always 3 steps ahead now. Elena's been so busy with her charity work lately, Marcus was saying, and I tuned back into the conversation. She's been putting in long hours at that financial consulting firm downtown. If only he knew what I'd really been doing at that charity. The shell companies I'd been establishing. The loans I'd been taking out in my name. The careful paper trail I'd been creating that would, in exactly 6 months and 2 days, transfer every single dollar of debt to my beloved husband. Such a giving heart, Diane murmured, but her eyes were calculating. I could practically see her wondering how to monetize my supposed charity work, how to spin it for social benefit. My father, who had spoken perhaps 10 words to me in the past month, suddenly looked up from his whiskey. The prenup signed, I assume? Just finished, Marcus confirmed, puffing up with pride. Very thorough document. Your lawyers certainly covered every contingency. They certainly did, I agreed, thinking of the particular contingency buried in Section 47. The one that stated, in very clear legal language, that all debts incurred by the bride prior to marriage would become the full legal and financial responsibility of the groom upon signing of the marriage certificate. It had taken me months to find lawyers corrupt enough to bury that clause so deep in legal jargon that even a careful reader might miss it. But Marcus wasn't a careful reader. Marcus was lazy and arrogant and convinced that his good looks and charm were enough to coast through life. In my first life, he'd been right. In this life, that laziness would destroy him. Well then, Diane raised her glass, to Elena and Marcus, may your marriage be everything you deserve. The toast echoed around the room, crystal clinking against crystal, everyone smiling and laughing and celebrating. But I heard the subtext in Diane's words, the same vicious undertone that had colored every interaction with her since my father had married her when I was 16. Everything you deserve. In my previous life, what I'd apparently deserved was betrayal, theft, institutionalization, and death. What I deserved was to watch the people I loved most strip away my identity, my sanity, and my life piece by piece. But this time would be different. This time they would get everything they deserved, and I would make sure they got it in full. The memory of my death hit me like it did sometimes, sudden and sharp as a knife between the ribs. The hospital room, sterile white and smelling of disinfectant. Victoria's face leaning over me as the drugs they'd been forcing down my throat for weeks finally took their toll. I'm sorry it had to be this way, she'd whispered, but her eyes had been dry. But you never knew when to give up, did you? Even when everyone told you that you were crazy, you kept insisting you were right about Marcus and me. Poor Elena, so paranoid, so unstable. At least now you'll finally be at peace. Peace. What a joke. I'd died furious, helpless, knowing the truth but unable to prove it. I'd died watching my sister inherit everything that should have been mine, marry the man who was supposed to love me, live the life that was supposed to be ours. But then I'd open my eyes in my childhood bedroom, 25 years old again with all my memories intact. The same day Marcus had first asked me out, exactly 1 year before our original engagement. This time I'd said yes to the date, but I'd been planning his destruction from the very first kiss. Earth to Elena! Victoria's laugh cut through my reverie. You're practically glowing. The bride-to-be is already in her own little world. Just thinking about how perfect everything is going to be, I replied, forcing my smile wider. How absolutely perfect. And it was going to be perfect. My revenge had been 18 months in the making, carefully orchestrated down to the last detail. The debt accumulation alone had taken months. Shell companies established in Nevada and Delaware, business loans taken out against fake projections, gambling debts incurred at underground establishments where records were kept in cash and handshakes, $23 million in carefully documented, legally binding debt. All of it mine until the moment Marcus signed that marriage certificate. All of it his, the second we were declared husband and wife. But the debt was just the beginning. In my previous life, I'd been too trusting, too naive to see the conspiracy forming around me. I'd believed Victoria when she said she was looking out for my interests. I'd believed Marcus when he said he loved me. I'd believed my father when he said the trust fund modifications were just routine legal updates. This time, I'd spent 18 months documenting everything. Audio recordings of their private conversations, obtained through bugs I'd planted in Marcus's apartment and Victoria's bedroom. Financial records showing the money trail from my trust fund to their personal accounts. Email conversations between Diane and her lawyer, discussing how to have me declared mentally incompetent. Evidence. Beautiful, irrefutable evidence of a conspiracy to defraud me of my inheritance and my life. Evidence that would be released to the media, the authorities, and every single person in our social circle exactly 24 hours after my wedding. But first, I wanted to watch Marcus's face when he realized what that prenup actually meant. I wanted to see Victoria's expression when she understood that her perfect plan had backfired spectacularly. I wanted to watch my father and stepmother scramble to explain why they'd participated in the systematic destruction of his only biological child. We should probably discuss the guest list, Diane was saying, pulling out her phone. I've been thinking we need to invite the Blackwoods, the Ashfords, definitely the Montgomerys. All the old families. All the society names who'd stood by and watched my disgrace in my previous life. Who'd whispered behind their champagne glasses about poor, unstable Elena Hawthorne. Who'd clucked their tongues sympathetically while doing absolutely nothing to help. They'd all be there. They'd all witness the greatest reversal of fortune in Manhattan social history. They'd all watch as the golden couple of Victoria and Marcus, because of course everyone knew they'd end up together eventually, crashed and burned in the most public way possible. That sounds wonderful, I said, squeezing Marcus's hand. I want everyone to be there. Everyone should witness our special day. Marcus squeezed back, his ring pressing against my fingers. The same fingers that, in my previous life, he'd held while lying about loving me. The same fingers that had worn his grandmother's ring, the one he'd secretly given to Victoria 2 weeks after proposing to me. This time, I'd made sure to buy that ring from the estate sale before he could retrieve it. It was sitting in a safe deposit box downtown, waiting to be one more piece of evidence in the spectacular trial that would follow our wedding. 6 months, I whispered to myself, counting down like it was Christmas morning. 6 months until the wedding, 6 months until the debt transferred. 6 months until the evidence went public. 6 months until they all got exactly what they deserved. And this time, I would be the one standing over their hospital beds, metaphorically speaking, watching them realize too late that they had underestimated Elena Hawthorne. This time, I would be the one walking away while they destroyed themselves with their own greed and cruelty. This time, the last laugh would be mine. The champagne tasted like victory as I raised my glass to match their toast. To love, I said, smiling at Marcus with all the innocence I could muster. And to getting exactly what we deserve. The irony was perfect. In 6 months, when that debt transferred and the evidence surfaced, Marcus would understand those words in a completely different way. They all would. But for now, they celebrated, toasting their own destruction while I counted down the days until their perfect world came crashing down around them. It was, I reflected, exactly as it should be. The familiar weight of deception settled around my shoulders like an expensive coat as we walked back through my father's mansion. Every smile, every laugh, every loving gesture toward Marcus was a lie, I told with increasing ease. The same lies they'd told me, wrapped up in promises and family bonds and declarations of love. In my previous life, those lies had killed me. In this one, they would save me and destroy everyone who'd ever hurt me. The math was simple, really, beautiful in its symmetry. 23 million in debt plus one arrogant fiancé plus 18 months of documented evidence equaled justice. Perfect, absolute, irreversible justice, and I couldn't wait to see their faces when they finally understood the equation. The memory of my first death came to me most often in the early morning hours, when the city was quiet and the penthouse apartment I'd rented under an assumed name felt like a fortress. I would lie in my king-size bed, staring at the ceiling, and remember every detail of that hospital room where my life had ended at 26. I'd been there for 3 months by then, supposedly recovering from a psychotic break that had never actually happened. The diagnosis had been Victoria's masterpiece, a carefully orchestrated campaign to discredit me that had started months before I'd ever suspected anything was wrong. First, it was small things. My coffee tasting bitter, making me jittery and paranoid. My prescription sleep medication making me groggy and confused during the day. Phone calls that I'd supposedly made but had no memory of, saying erratic things to business associates and family friends. "You've been under so much stress lately," Marcus had said, holding my hand in that patronizing way that made my skin crawl. "Maybe you should take a break from the trust fund management. Let Victoria and me handle things for a while." I'd been suspicious even then, but not suspicious enough. Not smart enough to realize that Victoria had been slowly poisoning me with low doses of psychiatric medications, that Marcus had been making those phone calls using voice modification software, that every piece of evidence of my mental instability had been manufactured. By the time I'd figured it out, it was too late. The forged documents transferring my trust fund to Victoria had already been filed. The psychological evaluation declaring me incompetent had been signed by a psychiatrist on their payroll. My own father had stood in a judge's chambers and sworn that his daughter was a danger to herself and others. "It's for your own good, Elena," Diane had said, as they'd committed me. "You'll understand someday, when you're better." But I was never supposed to get better. The treatment had been designed to break me completely, to make me so dependent on their version of reality that I'd never question it again. The drugs they'd forced down my throat had made me hallucinate, making my protests about forged documents and stolen money sound like the ravings of a madwoman. For 3 months, I'd fought to maintain my sanity, to hold on to the truth of what they'd done to me. I'd documented everything I could remember, writing it down on scraps of paper I hid around my room. I'd tried to convince nurses, doctors, anyone who would listen that I was being held there illegally. But Victoria had been so convincing in her role as the devoted sister. She'd visited twice a week, crying about how hard it was to watch her sister deteriorate. She'd brought flowers and books and spoke in gentle tones about how much she missed the real Elena. "The doctors say you're making progress," she'd said during that last visit, the one I remembered with crystal clarity. "They think you might be ready to come home soon." I'd been so hopeful, so desperate to believe that maybe she'd realized what they'd done was wrong, that maybe she wanted to make things right. Instead, she'd waited until the night nurse was on rounds, then slipped into my room with a syringe full of insulin. More than enough to kill me, administered to someone who wasn't diabetic. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered as she'd injected it into my IV line. "But you just wouldn't let it go. Even drugged out of your mind, you kept insisting you were right about everything. The lawyers say there's still a chance you could regain legal control of the trust fund if you recover. We can't risk that." I tried to call for help, but the drugs they'd been giving me had made me weak, my voice barely a whisper. I'd watched her disconnect my call button, move it just out of reach of my hand. "Marcus wanted to do it himself," she'd continued, checking the IV to make sure the insulin was flowing properly. "But I told him this was family business. Besides, I've always been better at cleaning up messes. The insulin had worked quickly. My blood sugar had plummeted, sending me into hypoglycemic shock. But even as I'd slipped into unconsciousness, Victoria had kept talking. You know what's funny? You always accused Marcus of being with me for the money, but you were half right. He's with me because I'm smart enough to get the money and keep it. You were always too soft, too trusting. You would have given half of it away to charity within a year. Those had been the last words I'd heard in my first life, the sound of my sister explaining why I deserved to die. Then I'd open my eyes in my childhood bedroom, 25 years old again, with the morning sun streaming through windows I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I'd thought it was a dream, some elaborate hallucination brought on by the drugs they'd been feeding me. But the memories had been too clear, too detailed. I'd known things about the future that hadn't happened yet. I'd remembered conversations that were still months away. I'd known about bank accounts that didn't exist yet, about legal documents that hadn't been forged yet, about plans that were still forming in Victoria's calculating mind. It had taken me 3 days to accept that I'd somehow been given a second chance. 3 days to stop waiting for the hallucination to end and start planning my revenge. The first step had been Marcus. In my original timeline, he'd asked me out on a Tuesday afternoon in October, approaching me outside the coffee shop where I'd been reading. This time, when he'd appeared with his practiced smile and his rehearsed opening line, I'd been ready. "Elena, right? I'm Marcus Chen. I've been trying to work up the courage to talk to you for weeks." The same line he'd used before, delivered with the same boyish charm that had made me blush in my previous life. This time, I'd smiled back and said yes to coffee, but I'd been recording the conversation on my phone. Evidence. Everything was about evidence this time. Over the following months, I'd played the part perfectly. The sweet, trusting heiress who was so grateful for his attention. The naive young woman who believed every lie he told about his feelings for her. I'd even let him think he was seducing me when, really, I was documenting every step of his plan to steal my fortune. The hardest part had been watching him with Victoria. Knowing that they were sleeping together, that they were laughing about how gullible I was, that they were planning my destruction even as they smiled to my face at family dinners. But I'd endured it. I'd smiled and played the loving sister, the devoted girlfriend, the dutiful daughter. I'd let them think they were winning while I built my case against them piece by piece. The shell companies had been Victoria's idea, or at least they had been in my original timeline. She'd suggested I diversify my investments, create some business ventures that could generate tax write-offs. She'd even recommended the lawyers who'd help me set them up. What she didn't know was that this time I'd modified their advice. This time, instead of setting up companies that would eventually be used to funnel money to her and Marcus, I'd set up companies designed to accumulate massive amounts of debt that would become Marcus's responsibility the moment we said "I do." It had taken 18 months to accumulate $23 million in legally binding obligations. Business loans based on falsified projections. Lines of credit secured against properties I didn't actually own. Gambling debts from underground poker games where I deliberately lost enormous sums. Every dollar of it documented, verified, and legally enforceable. The prenup had been the masterstroke. I'd let my father's lawyers draft most of it, knowing they'd include all the standard clauses protecting the family fortune. But I'd insisted on adding my own legal counsel to review the document, counsel who'd buried that debt assumption clause so deep in legal jargon that it would take a team of lawyers to find it. Marcus had signed it without reading past the first page, just like I'd known he would. "Babe, this thing is like a novel," he'd complained. "Can't we just trust your dad's lawyers to handle the boring stuff?" Trust. The word that had destroyed me in my first life and would destroy him in this one. Now, lying in my bed with 6 months to go until the wedding, I allowed myself to imagine their faces when they realized what had happened. Marcus, discovering that his new wife had saddled him with debts that would take 50 lifetimes to repay. Victoria, watching her perfect plan crumble as her lover faced bankruptcy and criminal charges. My father and Diane, realizing that their scheme to steal my inheritance had instead destroyed the family reputation forever. The evidence would surface exactly 24 hours after the wedding. Financial records showing the systematic theft of my trust fund. audio recordings of their conversations planning my destruction, email chains discussing my murder. Murder. That's what it had been. Even if they'd made it look like an accident. Premeditated murder for financial gain with conspiracy charges for everyone involved. In New York, that carried a potential life sentence. But first, I wanted them to understand what they'd lost. I wanted them to experience the same helplessness, the same betrayal, the same crushing realization that everything they'd believed about their lives was a lie. I wanted them to know how it felt to be Elena Hawthorne. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Victoria. Lunch tomorrow? Want to discuss wedding dress shopping? So excited to help you pick out something perfect. Perfect, the word she'd used to describe her plan to kill me. I typed back, absolutely. Can't wait to see what you have in mind. Let her think she was still in control. Let her believe she was still pulling the strings while I danced to her tune. In 6 months, she'd understand who had really been choreographing this dance. In 6 months, they'd all understand that dead girls sometimes came back to life. And when they did, they brought justice with them. The wedding dress appointment was Victoria's idea, of course. She'd made reservations at Kleinfeld, the same boutique where, in my previous life, she'd sabotaged my original dress by secretly having it altered to be unwearably tight. This time, I walked into the salon with my phone recording and a very different plan. Elena! Victoria rushed over to embrace me, her performance of sisterly devotion flawless as always. You look absolutely radiant. Marriage agrees with you already. If only she knew how much the prospect of this marriage agreed with me. How I fell asleep every night counting down the days until Marcus would realize what that prenup actually said. I'm so nervous, I confessed, letting my voice shake just enough to sell the performance. What if I can't find the right dress? What if nothing looks good on me? Sweetie, you're going to be stunning in whatever you choose, Victoria said, stroking my hair with the same hands that had injected insulin into my IV. That's what big sisters are for, to make sure you shine on your special day. Big sisters. The irony was so thick I could choke on it. Our consultant, a rail-thin woman named Miriam, appeared with champagne and a practiced smile. Miss Hawthorne, we're so excited to help you find your perfect dress. Your sister has already selected several options for you to try. Of course she had. In my previous life, Victoria had chosen dresses that were either unflattering or uncomfortable, all while gushing about how beautiful I looked. She'd steered me away from anything that actually suited me, convincing me that her taste was better than mine. Victoria has such an eye for fashion, I said, accepting the champagne. I trust her completely. The first dress she'd chosen was a monstrosity. Layers of tulle and beading that overwhelmed my frame, making me look like a child playing dress-up in her grandmother's curtains. Oh, Elena, Victoria breathed, pressing her hand to her chest. You look like a princess. I turned in the mirror, pretending to consider the dress seriously, while my phone, hidden in my purse, recorded every word. It's very dramatic, I said carefully. Dramatic is perfect for a Hawthorne wedding, Victoria insisted. You want to make a statement, don't you? Show everyone how important this day is? Important. This day would certainly be that. I suppose you're right, I said, then turned to Miriam. Could we try something a little simpler, more classic? Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment before settling back into place. Of course, sweetie. Whatever makes you happy. The second dress was better, a sleek column of silk that actually flattered my figure. But Victoria immediately found flaws. The neckline is a bit low, don't you think? And the fabric seems so plain. Marcus's family is very traditional. They might think it's inappropriate. Marcus's family, who had embraced Victoria as a daughter from the moment they'd met her. Who had, in my previous life, welcomed her as their daughter-in-law while barely acknowledging that I'd ever existed. Maybe something with more coverage? Victoria suggested, already signaling to Miriam. The third dress was perfect, a classic A-line with delicate lace sleeves and a modest neckline that somehow managed to be both elegant and striking. The moment I put it on, I knew it was the one. And so did Victoria, judging by the way her jaw tightened when I stepped out of the dressing room. It's lovely, she said, but her voice lacked enthusiasm. Very safe. Safe, Victoria's code word for boring. I love it, I said firmly, turning to admire myself in the three-way mirror. It's exactly what I pictured. Are you sure? Victoria pressed. I mean, it's fine, but it's so simple. Don't you want something more memorable? More you? More me. As if she had any idea who I really was. This is me, I said. And for the first time in months, I wasn't lying. This dress, this moment, this choice, it was all mine. Not Victoria's manipulation, not Marcus's preferences, not my family's expectations. Mine. Well, if you're certain, Victoria said, defeat creeping into her tone. Though I do think we should consider alterations. The bust might be a little tight and the hem could be shorter. Alterations. The same sabotage she'd used in my previous life, ensuring that my dress would be uncomfortable and unflattering on my wedding day. Actually, I said, turning to Miriam, I'd like to arrange for all alterations to be done here at the salon. And I'd like to be present for every fitting. Victoria blinked. That's not necessary, Elena. I could handle the alterations for you. I know how busy you are with the wedding planning. I want to be involved in every detail, I said sweetly. It's my wedding after all. Of course, Victoria said, but I caught the flash of frustration in her eyes. Your wedding. We completed the purchase, $4,700 for a dress that would witness the destruction of everyone who'd wronged me. Money well spent. As we walked out of the salon, Victoria looped her arm through mine in a gesture that looked sisterly and felt like a threat. I'm so happy for you, Elena, she said. You deserve all the happiness in the world. All the happiness in the world. From the sister who'd murdered me for money. I'm going to get exactly what I deserve, I replied. I can feel it. That evening, I sat in my penthouse apartment reviewing the audio from the dress appointment. Victoria's voice crystal clear, suggesting sabotage after sabotage. More evidence for the file that was growing thicker every day. My laptop chimed with a new email from Marcus. Hey babe, hope dress shopping went well. Victoria texted that you found something beautiful. Can't wait to see you in it. By the way, had lunch with your dad today? He mentioned some new investment opportunities. Thinks I should get more involved in managing your portfolio after we're married. Love you. Managing my portfolio. Of course he did. In my previous life, that management had involved systematically draining my accounts and transferring the money to shell companies controlled by him and Victoria. They'd been so careful, so methodical, stealing small amounts over months so that the theft wouldn't be immediately obvious. This time, my portfolio consisted mainly of debt. Beautiful, legal, enforceable debt that would become his responsibility in exactly 5 months and 18 days. I typed back, dress shopping was perfect. Victoria was so helpful. I think you and Daddy working together is a wonderful idea. You're both so smart about money. Can't wait to start our life together. XOXO. Every lie came easier than the last. Every false endearment felt like a weapon being sharpened. My phone rang, Victoria calling. Hi, sweetie. Her voice was honey sweet through the speaker. I just wanted to make sure you were happy with today. I know I can be a little enthusiastic about wedding planning. You were perfect, I said. I couldn't ask for a better sister. Good, Victoria said, relief evident in her tone. I was worried I might have been pushing too hard about the dress choices. I just want everything to be perfect for you. Perfect for you. The same words she'd used while injecting me with insulin. Victoria, I said, letting emotion creep into my voice. Can I tell you something? Of course, honey, you can tell me anything. I know we haven't always been as close as we should be, I began. But having you help with the wedding has meant so much to me. I feel like I'm finally getting the sister I always wanted. There was a long pause. When Victoria spoke again, her voice was softer, almost vulnerable. Elena, I've always wanted us to be closer too. I know I wasn't always the best sister when we were younger. I was jealous sometimes of how easy everything seemed for you. Easy. As if being slowly poisoned and murdered had been easy. None of that matters now, I said. What matters is that we're family, and family sticks together no matter what. No matter what, Victoria echoed, and I could hear tears in her voice. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost remembered the sister she'd been before money and jealousy had corrupted her completely. The girl who'd braided my hair and helped me with homework and promised we'd always be there for each other. But then I remembered the hospital room, the syringe, the casual way she'd explained why I deserved to die. I should let you go, I said. But Victoria, thank you for everything. I promise I'll never forget what you've done for me. I love you too, little sister, Victoria said softly. After she hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about love and family and the different ways people could destroy each other in the name of both. In 5 months and 18 days, Victoria would understand that I hadn't forgotten a single thing she'd done for me. She'd also understand that love could be just as destructive as hate. Maybe more so. The next 3 months passed in a blur of wedding preparations and careful orchestration. Every decision was calculated, every interaction recorded, every smile a weapon in disguise. Marcus, convinced he was marrying into money, threw himself into managing my investments with the enthusiasm of a man who believed he'd won the lottery. He spent hours on the phone with financial advisors talking about portfolio diversification and asset protection. If only he knew that every asset he was protecting was actually a liability waiting to destroy him. Your trust fund is more complicated than I expected, he told me over dinner at Le Bernardin, the restaurant where he'd proposed in both timelines. There are all these subsidiary accounts and business ventures. Victoria's been helping me understand the structure. Victoria, who had spent our childhood learning everything she could about the family finances. Victoria, who could navigate offshore accounts and shell companies like a bloodhound following a scent trail. She's always been so much better with numbers than me, I said, cutting into my Dover soul with practiced precision. I'm just glad you two get along so well. She really cares about you, Marcus said, and his tone suggested he believed it. She wants to make sure you're protected after we're married, that your assets are handled responsibly. Protected. The word they'd use to justify every violation, every theft, every step toward my eventual murder. How thoughtful of her, I murmured. Actually, Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. She had an interesting suggestion about the prenup. She thinks we should add some additional clauses about debt protection. Make sure that any obligations you might incur are properly isolated from our joint assets. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. This was new, a deviation from the original timeline that sent my pulse racing. Debt protection, I asked carefully. Just a precaution, Marcus said quickly. I mean, you're so generous with your charity work, so trusting with business partners. Victoria's worried that someone might try to take advantage of that after we're married. Of course she was. Victoria had always been paranoid about people trying to steal what she considered hers. In my previous life, that paranoia had extended to me, her own sister, who she'd convinced herself was a threat to her inheritance. That sounds very responsible, I said, keeping my voice neutral while my mind raced. Though I thought the prenup was already finalized. It is, Marcus said. But there's always time for amendments before the wedding. Victoria found a legal firm that specializes in high net worth asset protection. She thinks they could strengthen some of the language. New lawyers who might actually read the fine print. Which firm? I asked. Henderson, Klein, and Associates. They come highly recommended. Henderson, Klein, and Associates. I'd never heard of them, which meant they hadn't existed in my original timeline. This was Victoria adapting, getting smarter, closing loopholes I hadn't expected her to find, but I'd been adapting too. That sounds wonderful, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. But honey, I have to ask, are you having second thoughts about marrying me? All this talk about asset protection and debt isolation, it sounds like you're planning for our marriage to fail. Marcus's eyes widened. Elena, no, that's not what this is about at all. I love you. I want to marry you. This is just about being smart, being prepared. I know, I said, letting my voice tremble slightly. It's just, my mother always told me that when people start talking about protecting assets from each other, it means they don't really trust each other. Your mother was wrong, Marcus said firmly, squeezing my hand. This isn't about trust. It's about making sure we're both protected, no matter what happens. No matter what happens. How prophetic. If you really think it's necessary, I said, then of course we should meet with these lawyers. I trust your judgment. That night, I called the contact number I'd memorized 18 months ago, a man who specialized in problems that required creative solutions. Henderson, Klein, and Associates, I said when he answered. I need to know everything about them by tomorrow morning. That's going to cost extra, he said. Rush job, financial records. That kind of deep dive isn't cheap. Money's not an issue, I replied, but time is, and accuracy is essential. Understood. You'll have the file by 6 a.m. The file, when it arrived, made for interesting reading. Henderson, Klein, and Associates was a legitimate firm, but they specialized in exactly the kind of legal maneuvering that Victoria would find appealing. They'd helped 3 celebrity clients hide assets during messy divorces, assisted a tech mogul in transferring liabilities to shell companies before bankruptcy, and defended a pharmaceutical heiress against fraud charges by arguing that she'd been legally manipulated by her business partners. They were very good at finding loopholes, they were also very expensive, and their client list included some names that made me smile. People who owed me favors. People who might be interested in knowing that their legal representation was being used to defraud a grieving daughter out of her inheritance. By 8 a.m., I had 3 different ways to neutralize Henderson, Klein, and Associates if they became a problem. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Victoria was planning. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at their Midtown offices. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in my most conservative suit and carrying a briefcase full of financial documents that would make their eyes water. $23 million in debt, carefully categorized and documented. My wedding gift to Marcus. Miss Hawthorne, the receptionist smiled warmly. Mr. Henderson is ready for you in Conference Room A. Conference Room A was all mahogany and leather, designed to intimidate clients into paying higher fees. Marcus was already there, looking nervous in his best suit. Victoria sat beside him, perfectly composed in cream-colored silk. Elena! Victoria rose to embrace me, her smile warm enough to melt ice. Thank you so much for being flexible about this. I know it seems last minute, but when I heard about Henderson, Klein's expertise in asset protection, I just knew we had to consult with them. Of course, I said, returning her hug. Anything that makes you feel more secure about my financial future. Mr. Henderson himself entered the room, a silver-haired man in his 60s who radiated competence and expensive cologne. He was followed by a younger woman with sharp eyes and a sharper suit. Miss Hawthorne, Mr. Chen, so pleased to meet you both. I'm James Henderson, and this is my associate, Patricia Klein. We've reviewed the prenup your father's attorneys drafted, and while it's quite thorough, we believe there are some areas where additional protection might be warranted. Additional protection. I was beginning to hate that phrase. What kind of areas? I asked, settling into the leather chair across from them. Patricia Klein consulted her tablet. Primarily debt assumption clauses. The current document has some language about financial obligations, but it's rather vague. In today's complex financial environment, we recommend much more specific provisions. Specific provisions that would uncover my carefully buried debt transfer clause. I see, I said slowly, and what would these specific provisions look like? Henderson leaned forward. Essentially, we'd add language stating that any debts incurred by either party prior to marriage remain the sole responsibility of the party who incurred them. Full financial disclosure with penalties for any debts exceeding a certain threshold that weren't declared prior to signing. Full financial disclosure. That would require me to reveal the $23 million in obligations I'd been so carefully accumulating. Victoria watched my face carefully. It's not that we don't trust you, Elena. It's just that in our family's position, we have to be careful about liability exposure. Our family. As if she'd been born a Hawthorne instead of marrying into it when her mother trapped my father. Of course, I said. Though I have to admit, I'm a little confused about the timing. Why didn't we address this 18 months ago when the prenup was originally drafted? 18 months ago, your financial situation was much simpler, Victoria said smoothly. But you've been so active with your investments lately, all those new business ventures. We just want to make sure everything's properly documented. Everything's properly documented. That was exactly what she was afraid of. Actually, I said, opening my briefcase, since we're talking about full financial disclosure, I should probably share something with everyone. The room went very still. I pulled out the first folder, a neat stack of loan documents, credit agreements, and promissory notes. I've been meaning to mention this to Marcus, but with all the wedding planning, the timing never seemed right. Marcus's face had gone pale. What is that? Well, I said, spreading the documents across the mahogany table like a poker player revealing a royal flush. I've accumulated some obligations over the past 18 months. Business investments, mostly. Some of them haven't gone as planned. Victoria leaned forward, her composure cracking. What kind of obligations, Elena? Oh, I said airily. The usual. Business loans for startup ventures that didn't quite work out. Some credit lines I used for charitable donations. A few gambling debts from those poker games you introduced me to, Victoria. Nothing too serious. How much? Henderson asked, his professional demeanor slipping. I pretended to calculate, flipping through the documents. Let's see, carrying costs, compound interest, penalty fees. I'd estimate around 23 million, give or take. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus found his voice first. 23. Elena, what the hell have you been doing? Investing in our future, I said sweetly. Don't worry, darling. According to our prenup, marriage debt becomes shared debt. So technically, half of it will be yours anyway. That's not how it works, Patricia Klein said sharply, already pulling up documents on her tablet. The prenup specifically states that... She stopped mid-sentence, her face going white as she read. Actually, I said, pulling out my own copy of the signed prenup. If you look at Section 47, subsection 12, paragraph C, you'll see that all debts incurred by the bride prior to marriage become the full legal and financial responsibility of the groom upon signing of the marriage certificate. Henderson snatched the document from Klein's hands, scanning the pages frantically. When he found the clause, his expression turned thunderous. This is unconscionable, he said. No competent attorney would allow their client to sign something like this. And yet Marcus did sign it, I pointed out, after swearing under oath that he'd read and understood every provision. Victoria's mask had finally slipped completely. Elena, what game are you playing? Game. As if my murder had been a game too. I'm not playing anything, I said, my voice hardening. I'm just making sure that everyone gets exactly what they deserve. Marcus was hyperventilating. $23 million? Elena, that's impossible. Where did you get access to that kind of credit? Family name opens a lot of doors, I said. Amazing how eager people are to lend money to a Hawthorne. Especially when they think it's guaranteed by the family trust fund. The trust fund that you won't inherit until you're 30, Victoria said, her voice deadly quiet. True, I acknowledged, which means technically I have no way to pay these debts. But Marcus will, won't he? After all, he signed a legal document taking full responsibility for them. This is fraud, Henderson declared. No court in the world would enforce a contract obtained under false pretenses. False pretenses? I tilted my head innocently. Mr. Henderson, are you suggesting that Marcus didn't read the prenup before signing it? Because that would make him pretty stupid, wouldn't it? Elena, Victoria's voice was shaking with rage. You can't do this. This is insane. Insane. The same word they'd used to justify having me committed. You know what's insane, Victoria? I stood up, gathering my documents. Trusting family. Believing that the people who claim to love you actually have your best interests at heart. Signing legal documents without reading them. I looked directly at Marcus. You want to know what's really insane? Thinking you can steal someone's inheritance, murder them when they figure it out, and face no consequences. The room erupted. Murder? Marcus leapt to his feet. Elena, what are you talking about? No one's murdered anyone. Not yet, I said calmly. But you were planning to, weren't you? After you got control of my trust fund, after you transferred all my assets to accounts you and Victoria controlled, I would have had an unfortunate accident, just like I did before. Before? Victoria's face had gone gray. Elena, you're not making sense. You're talking about things that never happened. Haven't happened yet, I corrected. But they were going to. The same way they happened in my first life. Henderson was frantically typing on his phone, probably calling security or the police or both. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. But Victoria? Victoria was staring at me with something that might have been recognition. You remember, don't you? I said to her quietly. Deep down, some part of you remembers the hospital room, the insulin, the way you explained why I deserved to die. You're insane, Victoria whispered, but there was fear in her eyes now. Maybe, I acknowledged, Or maybe I'm just tired of being the victim. I snapped my briefcase closed and headed for the door. Gentlemen, you'll be hearing from my attorneys about the prenup. It's ironclad, by the way. I made sure of that. Elena, wait, Marcus called after me. We can fix this. We can amend the prenup, renegotiate the terms. The wedding is in 2 months, I said without turning around. Unless you want to call it off? The silence behind me was answer enough. As I waited for the elevator, I heard raised voices from the conference room. Marcus shouting at Victoria, Victoria screaming back at him, both of them demanding that Henderson find a way out of the legal trap I'd built around them. But there was no way out. I'd spent 18 months making sure of that. The elevator arrived, and I stepped inside, watching the conference room door through the glass walls until the floors ticked past and took them out of view. 2 months until the wedding. 2 months until Marcus realized that $23 million was just the beginning. 2 months until they all learned what Elena Hawthorne was really capable of. The elevator reached the ground floor, and I walked out into the Manhattan afternoon with the satisfaction of a job well done. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was about to begin. And this time, I would be the one walking away from the hospital bed. The 2 months between the Henderson-Klein meeting and the wedding passed in a chaos of desperate legal maneuvering and increasingly frantic family meetings. Marcus hired 3 different law firms to find a way out of the prenup, each one reaching the same conclusion. The document was bulletproof. Victoria tried a different approach, suggesting that I undergo psychological evaluation to determine if I was competent to make legal decisions. It's just a precaution, she said during one particularly tense dinner at my father's house. You've been acting so strangely lately, talking about things that never happened. We're all worried about your mental state. My mental state. The same concern they'd weaponized to have me committed in my previous life. I appreciate your concern, I said, cutting my steak with deliberate precision. But I've never felt more clear-headed in my life. Sweetheart, my father interjected, his voice heavy with disappointment. This debt situation is troubling. $23 million in obligations without consulting the family? Without any oversight? Oversight. The same oversight that had allowed them to steal millions from my trust fund in my original timeline. I was investing in my future, Daddy, I said. Isn't that what you always taught me? That money should work for you? Not like this, Diane said sharply. This is reckless endangerment of the family's financial stability. Family. As if any of them had ever considered me family when it mattered. Marcus, who had been silent through most of the meal, finally spoke. Elena, we need to discuss postponing the wedding, at least until we can get this debt situation resolved. Postponing? The word hung in the air like a threat. Why would we postpone? I asked, meeting his eyes across the table. Don't you love me anymore, Marcus? Don't you want to be my husband? Of course I love you, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. But this changes things. We need time to figure out how to protect both of us. Protect both of us. Code for protect him from me. The only thing that's changed, I said, is that you all know I'm not as naive as you thought I was. Is that really such a bad thing? It's not about being naive, Victoria said. It's about being rational. About making decisions that make sense. Rational, the same word she'd used to justify murder. You're right, I said, setting down my fork. Let me be rational. Marcus, do you want to marry me or not? The question caught him off guard. He glanced at Victoria, then at my father before answering. Yes, of course I want to marry you. Then we get married as scheduled, I said firmly. All this talk about debt and protection and psychological evaluations? It sounds like you're all trying to convince me that I'm crazy for wanting to marry the man I love. That's not what we're doing, Victoria protested. Isn't it? I looked around the table at their faces. Guilty, calculating, desperate. You're acting like marrying me would be the worst thing that could happen to Marcus. Like I'm some kind of burden to be managed instead of a woman he chose to spend his life with. Elena, my father said carefully, we're just trying to look out for everyone's best interests. Everyone's but mine, I pointed out. My interests don't seem to matter much in this conversation. The silence that followed was telling. I think, I said, standing up and placing my napkin on the table, that I'll spend the rest of this evening somewhere I'm actually wanted. As that, I walked out of that dining room with their voices calling after me, but I didn't stop. I had what I needed: confirmation that they were exactly who I'd remembered them to be: selfish, manipulative, and willing to sacrifice me the moment it became convenient. The next morning, Victoria called me. "Elena, we need to talk." "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. "About what you're really trying to accomplish with this wedding." We met at Café Luxembourg, the same place where, in my original timeline, Victoria had convinced me that Marcus's growing distance was just pre-wedding jitters. This time, she dispensed with pretense. "I know what you're doing," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "The debt, the prenup clause, the psychological evaluation comments. You're trying to trap Marcus." "Trap him?" I repeated. "By marrying him? I thought that's what people in love were supposed to do." "Cut the act, Elena," Victoria said sharply. "You're not in love with him. You never were. This is about something else." Something else. So close to the truth, yet missing the most important part. "What do you think it's about?" I asked. Victoria studied my face. "Revenge," she said finally, "though I can't figure out what for. Marcus has been nothing but good to you. We all have." Good to me, the words were so absurd I almost laughed. "Have you?" I asked softly. "Have you all been good to me, Victoria?" "Of course we have," she said, but doubt flickered in her eyes. "Elena, you're my sister. I love you." "Do you?" I leaned forward. "Do you really love me, Victoria? Or do you love what I represent? The trust fund, the family name, and the social position?" "That's not fair," Victoria protested. "Money isn't everything." "Isn't it?" I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table between us. "Then you won't mind if I record this conversation, just to make sure we both remember what we talked about." Victoria went very still. "Why would you want to record us?" "Protection," I said, echoing her favorite word. "I want to make sure that if anyone ever questions my mental state again, I have proof of exactly what was said to me and by whom." "Elena," Victoria's voice was careful now, controlled. "I think you should talk to someone, a professional, about these paranoid thoughts you've been having." Paranoid thoughts. The same phrase that had preceded my commitment in my original timeline. "What paranoid thoughts?" I asked innocently. "This idea that everyone is out to get you," Victoria said. "That Marcus is only marrying you for money. That the family is conspiring against you. These delusions about things that never happened." Delusions. Another word they'd used to justify my murder. "You know what's interesting about delusions?" I said. "Sometimes they turn out to be true." I pressed record on my phone. "Tell me, Victoria," I said clearly, "if I were to die unexpectedly after marrying Marcus, who would inherit my trust fund?" Victoria's face went white. "Elena, what kind of question is that?" "A practical one," I replied. "I mean, accidents happen, right? People die young all the time. Car crashes, medical emergencies, accidents at home." "You're scaring me," Victoria whispered.